Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ruminations. I am your host, Bobby Gill, and today we are diving into the world of policymaking. Specifically, we'll be talking about policy and legislation that supports healthy soils and better land management practices. Now, this will be a largely US focused conversation since that is our guest's area of expertise. But don't worry, we'll also get into soil health policy landscape outside of the US. And to guide us through it all, I couldn't ask for a better guest. Aria McLauchlan is the co founder and executive director of LandCore, a nonprofit that works closely with the USDA, legislators, producers, soil scientists, NGOs, and financial institutions across the US to develop policy recommendations that build healthy soils, resilient farmers, and national food security. This includes guiding the successful passage of language in both the House and Senate, supporting soil health outcomes at the USDA, and helping to secure over $50 million in federal investment in soil health in the 2018 Farm Bill. Aria's work has earned her recognition as an emerging leader in food and agriculture, and she brings a fascinating background spanning branding and marketing for major organizations like Nat Geo and the Rainforest Alliance to deep-rooted work in ag policy and advocacy. Aria is not just a policy expert, she's a communicator, a strategist, and someone who understands how to bring the multitude of benefits that come from soil health and make that a compelling issue for lawmakers. Today, we'll explore how she does it, what's ahead for soil health in the US, and how all of us, regardless of if we live in the US or not, how we can be a part of the solution. And that includes getting into how the sausage is made for policy, how to effectively communicate with lawmakers, bills that are flying under the radar, LandCore's bill tracker that you can find on their website, and so much more. It's a fascinating conversation, even if you're not a policy wonk like myself. So, without further ado, here is my episode with Aria McLauchlan of LandCore. But first, a word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by Savory's growing community of regenerating members, listeners like you who care about real solutions for our global grasslands. Over the past decade, the Savory Institute has helped restore more than 100 million acres through holistic planned grazing, creating productive and resilient landscapes where fertile soils lead to healthy food and thriving communities. But this kind of impact is only possible with support from people like you. For just $10 a month, less than the cost of lunch, your support can help restore nearly 400 acres of land every single year. And as a regenerating member, you'll join our global community of over 600 like-minded people committed to making real change where it matters the most. You'll get access to Savory's private online network, a free holistic management online course, discounts from partner brands, and even opportunities to connect with Alan Savory. Signing up is fast, easy, and it makes a real impact. Just visit savory.global/member, that's savory.global/MEMBER, and start making an impact today. Aria McLauchlan, welcome to the Ruminations podcast.
Bobby Gill, thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and guiding us through the wonderful world of policy and legislation. I know it's everyone's favorite topic, isn't it?
Yes, hold on to your coffee cups tightly, folks. We'll get through this together. No, it actually can be quite a certainly endlessly interesting, but also exciting topic.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so I was surrounded by politics my entire life. I worked for the federal government for nearly a decade at the FDA. All of that said, I don't consider myself someone who is a policy wonk who finds themselves diving into the nitty gritty of how the sausage is made. And so, I have to ask, where did your interest in policy come from? Especially because I think folks will probably be able to tell shortly as we talked, you have an Australian accent. So, you're an Aussie who focuses primarily on American policy related to soil health. How did all of that come about?
Well, let's see. I'm fortunate enough to belong to both countries. So I'm an American as well as an Australian. I have a parent from both countries. And I was lucky enough to grow up and go to school in Australia. So my background in terms of just neighbors and friends and surrounding community was quite a rural and agriculturally focused environment, but also just For folks that know the Australian bush, just an incredible childhood and experience living outdoors and seeing all the creatures and everything there. But I would say policy certainly wasn't what I planned to be focused on. It's not what I went to school for. But I would say that the interest stems in just a focus and a keen interest in being able to make change in whatever system or business or issue that I care about. And I think ultimately being involved in policy and to some degree in my personal life, politics, is just empowering. It's just a place where we have so much more agency. And that's kind of part of the cool part of the democratic process is that we can just get involved regardless of our backgrounds. So I would say that that the sort of genesis started there, that
Was
idea.
there any one particular moment or a piece of legislation or, what was the driving factor that really caused you to say, "Oh, policy is something that I'm gonna put my full weight behind, and I'm gonna start an organization that is fully dedicated to this?"
Yes. Well, I think my originally my the sort of original choice for a career was choosing to focus on business and brand because I was aware that focusing on different aspects of sustainability or social impact or environment in ways that I was like, I can understand why folks want to present a message in a certain way, but I might already be sympathetic to your cause. And even I'm a little turned off, some of that sort of like heavy green hammer over the head, the sort of idea of a lecture or what have you. So that's why I was always interested in using business and branding and communications as a good vehicle for change for the issues that need more love and attention. And then with policy specifically, as I had entered into the soil health space, and this is, I think, at the end of this year, it'll be getting on into 10 years now, which is just incredible, remarkable to think about how long I've been talking about dirt at dinner parties. Um,
Soil, not dirt.
soil. That's right. But folks are cottoning on, which is nice. So I had the opportunity to start working on and thinking about this issue via another well-known nonprofit organization in the space, Kiss the Ground. And at that time, this was 2015. Uh, Especially working from a communications perspective, we were kind of missing a clear call to action in terms of what we could tell individuals or consumers, or even to some degree, farmers and other organizations. Like, okay, you're interested in soil health, you understand that it's connected to all of these incredible benefits, but what is the action that folks could take? And there was a little bit of a cart before the horse feeling. And as I got into conversations with my partner and now co-founder Harley, we really clearly kind of identified that there was missing economic incentives for producers, asking farmers and ranchers to make these huge changes to their businesses and their practices without really clear economic incentives. In some cases, there are missing infrastructure that would support folks in adopting these practices. And just in general, better making the economic case for this work is something that we thought was really important. And as we looked around and kind of looked at the landscape, especially here in the US, for us, it was just a really obvious sort of driving reality that so much of the existing infrastructure and then so much of the policy of what we grow and how we grow it is determined by federal policy. So we really just firmly believe that if you want to be involved in changing the food and agriculture system and in supporting farmers and ranchers in any way, that you really do have to be involved in policy in one way or another.
Mhm. Well, and, as someone who, working for the Savory Institute, we work globally. And
Yeah.
so it's hard for me and others on the team to keep track of all the updates, not just of what's happening in American policy for soil health and better land management practices, but then also what's going on in the UK and further out in the EU, what's happening in different countries in South America, what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Australia, New Zealand. Like, it goes on and on and on, and
Yeah.
there's so much to keep track of. So I know that whenever I get a policy question, I refer folks directly to you and I say, don't ask me, go ask Aria and Harley. They're the ones over at LandCore who can handle all of this. So why don't you actually tell the folks a little bit about LandCore? So what is this organization that you started? What are you guys up to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, you're very generous with those referrals, so we always appreciate that. But
It's
LandCore
just
is
it's just easier for me to just pass along the referral, honestly.
we're
It's just
we're
laziness.
not at all. We're here to be a resource. We're here to help folks out as best we can. So LandCore is a nonprofit organization that Harley Cross and I co-founded in 2017. We have a mission to advance soil health policies and programs that create value for farmers, businesses, and communities. And as I kind of shared with our origin story, we are constantly looking for ways to advance better economic incentives that can support producers here in the US in adopting soil health practices and better making the case. And we really feel that doing that through federal policy is an extremely sort of important lever of change. So we do work both identifying and advancing our own specific policy priorities, and we can touch on those in a bit. But also, we do help to orient other organizations, other stakeholders, whether it's a group of funders, a group of other organizations focused on conservation, businesses like food and clothing companies, for example, in identifying where the policies are in the federal space and helping folks to sort of exert their influence that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you've mentioned a few times already the economic case for better soil health. Is that the main avenue for impacting change? Because the economic case could be seen as something very different from the environmental case. They're obviously one and the same when you're taking a holistic approach to this. What is environmentally appropriate will also be economically appropriate. But why is it that you are focusing primarily on the economic case for this?
Yes. Well, I think that first and foremost, in addition to farmers and ranchers' connection to the landscape, they're also running businesses. This is very rarely just an act of stewardship or land management in and of itself. It's a business first and foremost for folks, and so both in order for farmers to be able to show up at all, to be able to access land, to be able to sustain their farming businesses, to maybe not need to take one or two or three additional off-farm jobs in order to sustain themselves. And then, as I sort of indicated, being able to, if folks are on a sort of track of a more conventionally managed agriculture system, being able to transition to make those changes to their businesses and practices is quite a big undertaking. There's a lot of both actual and then I would say also perceived risk. And so being able to show farmers really clearly that there are not only economic upsides, but potentially even real gains, real profitability, sort of real business resilience to be gained. I think that is just first and foremost really important to farmers. And then I would also add that, while there certainly are folks who are on the land and farming because they see the benefits to nutrition, to community, to resilience in their local environments, that there are plenty of folks who are not motivated by that. And so while there are many folks who have found their way into the space of holistic management or soil health or what have you, because of some of those wonderful sort of environmental benefits, that we see that that's not necessarily the message that is going to resonate with farmers first and foremost. So I think it's also just sort of meeting folks where they are and speaking their language, and both soil health as a framing as well as the economic benefits of soil health, I
Mhm.
think tend to resonate with folks fairly universally.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks, if you would ask them if they prefer the carrot or the stick, most people would rather prefer the carrot, to have an incentive rather than some sort of punishment or penalty for land degrading practices. So
Indeed.
that's
Yeah.
the case for what drives change with the farmers. What about for policymakers? What resonates most with policymakers when you're talking to them?
Well, I think, as you say, with the carrot, that's kind of the whole name of the game of policymaking for agriculture here in the U.S. The sort of the broad consensus Is that what is both needed, effective, appreciated, going to fly with policymakers, and then ultimately be received in a federal agency and received by our farmers and be successful? Are those sort of voluntary initiatives and incentives and things that are sort of like local or state-led or contextual, so that farmers can pick and choose what works for them? So I think policymakers are very sensitive to those needs, and they're kind of one and the same. There's also sort of zoomed out from a kind of purse strings perspective, the overall cost of the federal budget, or the cost of some of the major pieces of farm legislation, and the Farm Bill being the major one here in the US. That sort of total cost of the Farm Bill is a constant sort of source of conversation. So someone might come in and just be like, oh, if we just drop hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars on farmers, we could do all of these amazing things. And that's sort of true. But whether or not passing an expensive proposal like that is possible or even sort of advisable is kind of a question. So finding ways to have sort of innovative, no and low cost policy proposals is something I think that resonates certainly with members in Congress. But then I think it also kind of ties through back into what works for the farmers, which is asking a question about like, well, how can we just kind of get out of their way, remove policy barriers, and just sort of unlock the natural genius and innovation of farmers and ranchers who kind of know what's best on their land.
You've dealt with a lot of policymakers, is that correct? In terms of, going to Capitol Hill, walking into offices, having sit-down meetings with them to talk about specific bills that are, being considered, or helping them draft language for bills that, you might be working on together. Can you walk us through what it's like to walk into a congressional office in Capitol Hill? Like, how does that happen? How does the meeting go? Are are you mainly talking to the congressman, or are you talking to their staff? Who are the people that are actually making decisions? Are they actually paying attention to what you're saying? Like, do they really understand the true opportunity that lies with improved soil health? Like, how does all that look from an outsider's perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's definitely an experience. Folks who have gone to either a state or federal capital to lobby or to meet with representatives and their staff to talk about an issue. It can be quite an experience. Folks are kind of getting dressed up and wearing their better business looking suits. Although I've seen plenty of farmers and ranchers keep their hat on, and I think we like that. We like to see those folks kind of come in and be themselves in those spaces. So that's always fun. Um, and yeah, we are primarily, as I was kind of saying at the beginning with the sort of democratic process, it is surprisingly, I think, accessible to reach out to a member of Congress, certainly anyone who represents you personally, but then also members who are interested in a particular issue. So in our case, for example, we would start with and often focus on members of Congress who are members of either the House or Senate agricultural committees. So regardless of what state or district they're representing, they have been elected to serve on these committees. And so we'll target those folks and say, hey, we have some policy ideas and recommendations on soil health, on agriculture, on the Farm Bill. This is based on our listening to farmers and ranchers across the country and other organizations. So very often we're sort of taking a sort of broad set of the issues that we hear out in the world and then kind of funneling down a few sort of select facts, figures, farmer stories, issues that say economic statistics or adoption rates of, say, cover crops or another soil health practice in that member's state, and kind of bringing all that together to share where we think the opportunity is. We will also sort of share our kind of approach to policy making. So we'll sort of say, we're LandCore, we're a nonprofit organization. Our approach to policy is focused on, as I said, no cost voluntary initiatives that aren't about expanding government or about new regulations, but are about supporting producers and helping secure their bottom line. So we try to sort of meet members and their staff where they're at and kind of take it from there. I have heard, these can be kind of long days. You're walking up and down the halls of the House and Senate buildings and trying to find the right office and kind of trotting around. And it can be tiring, but it's also exciting. I've had a staffer say, well, at least all of your meetings were on the same topic. And it is a good reminder that staff and members are just dealing with a huge kind of deluge of issues in any given day. And they're super, super busy folks. So it isn't, yeah, it's an interesting opportunity. And we like to kind of to get in there as often as we can, or to work with farmers as well, to have folks hear directly from them. Those meetings are always the best.
Yeah. Do you feel that the potential of soil health is truly understood by American lawmakers, or is this something that they hear, okay, here's another advocacy group who's coming forward. They've got some ideas. Okay, we'll write it down and consider it, and maybe we'll do something small, to help you out. But where do they stand in terms of truly understanding what lies ahead of them for improved soil health?
I I think initially you would be right to have that sort of maybe skepticism about, well, how much are they really understanding? And I think, of course, there's always more to do. Both members of Congress and their staff do turnover, so that can be a little bit of a challenge where you can develop a relationship with someone, and then if they change out, then you kind of need to start again. So I think that's part of why policy organizations just need a lot of sort of resource and support, because there is this sort of ongoing educational work that's happening in the background. That said, LandCore has a federal soil health bill tracker that tracks bills that have been introduced into Congress that would have some impact on soil health and resilience. And it was something like over 250 bills that were introduced in the previous Congress, so that sort of the previous 2 years, that had some impact on soil health and resilience. But it's just a tremendous increase on where we were even a handful of years ago. So I think the number of folks on both sides of the aisle, and we've really seen that ramp up in the last couple of months. There is this connection that folks are starting to make between soil health and human health, and the health of our food being directly tied to healthy soil. We're also starting to see, I think, the beginnings of a real understanding about soil health as a risk mitigation strategy. And I'd love to touch on that with you a little bit more. I think the sort of soil as a carbon sink has also been surprisingly well adopted by both, again, on both sides of the aisle, maybe for different reasons. I think there's more of an environmental and climate perspective on the left, but on both sides, you're seeing folks recognize the business opportunity of carbon markets, of ecosystem service markets, of sustainable aviation fuel, grown with sort of feedstocks from that lower carbon intensity feedstocks is kind of the term that they're using for it, for sustainable aviation fuel. These are like real hard markets and economic incentives for producers. Maybe it's not the reason that they get in the game, but it certainly is a signal about a direction that they can go in. And so those kinds of opportunities for farmers, for rural districts, is just really kind of undeniable. And we've seen a huge sort of injection of support and capital for that in the last 6 months, a year, a couple of years. It really has been quite a noticeable increase. So long way to go and lots of progress.
Well, it's great to hear all the momentum that's happened in recent years. Let's focus in a little more closely on some of those main levers, or those buckets that you were just speaking to. So you were mentioning risk mitigation, soil as a carbon sink, aspects of human health, just
Yeah.
better, more profitable businesses. Let's start with risk mitigation, I guess. Tell us about risk mitigation and why that matters from a policy perspective.
So a lot of folks anecdotally, I think, understand on any given farm and ranch that if they are building their soil health, that they're building their resilience, especially in terms of flood and drought, that they're just more able to hold on to water when it rains and to be able to better sort of be buffered through dry conditions or times of drought. And so we kind of have that understanding anecdotally, but from our observations, we came to realize that the institutions that are in the business of assessing and quantifying risk, like our agricultural lenders and insurers and policymakers, are not necessarily taking those risk mitigating benefits into account. When a farmer goes to their local lender, that lender is usually looking at sort of traditional uh, credit metrics and financials, and isn't necessarily doesn't understand or even really have the ability to quantify what that risk reduction might be. And even if you had some sort of inherent understanding and trust and belief in, okay, yes, sure, soil health is going to mean that the producer is more diversified and resilient and able to weather both sort of like market and weather events in a better way. That these are not institutions that are in the business of guessing. We're sort of taking our word for it. These are folks who want to say, okay, well, to what extent would this risk mitigation benefit be true? Where, there's both in policy and then I think on the ground, there is a little bit of like, well, maybe those practices work for that state over there, but that's not going to work for us here in California or here in Iowa. There's an idea and uncertainty about to what degree, say, cover crops or rotating crops might be beneficial. So being able to demonstrate and do the research on the risk reducing benefits of certain soil health practices is an idea that we think can be incorporated by financial institutions, and then ultimately in terms of policy, USDA and an agency called the Risk Management Agency that oversees this huge program of federal crop insurance, federally subsidized crop insurance, subsidized by the taxpayer. That is such it's a big program in terms of dollars, but it's a really big lever in terms of driving what we grow and how we grow it. And it's often required for farmers to have crop insurance in order to be able to get loans and things like that. So, to the extent that the crop insurance program is sort of indicating its support for, say, monocropping of just single commodity row crops, that obviously kind of sets us in a direction. And then conversely, if USDA and Risk Management Agency, as well as private sector insurers, are either given research or directed to do studies and research of their own, we think it could be incredibly powerful for those folks to look into, do their own accounting into the risk reducing benefits of these practices. And then if and where they find a benefit, again, don't take my word for it as a soil health advocate, but if and where you find a benefit, make a discount or an incentive for producers. And just to kind of give a look at the world that we're imagining here, this could be something like a good soil discount that's as commonplace for farmers and ranchers in agriculture as it is a good driver discount on your auto insurance or a non-smoker discount in health insurance. Those kinds of discounts are not there because the insurance companies like you or their friends, or it's just an impartial sort of business assessment based on their understanding and calculation of the risk. And so that we think is an important sort of driver for meeting farmers where they're at, because again, the finance and insurance are sort of business tools that they're using in their operations every day anyway, and because it could have a really big impact on sort of an important market signal that lets producers know that this is sort of a less risky direction for them to go.
Yeah, I think it's an important nuance to bring up, specifically related around crop insurance. Um, I think in the regenerative space, you'll sometimes hear folks claim, all we need to do is get rid of commodity subsidies and it will level the playing field for regenerative ag. And that's the solution to move things forward. How does that statement sit with you?
Maybe easier said than done would probably be one initial reaction to that. These are huge sort of systems, and I think some of these row crop commodities have an important role to play. I think whether folks are talking about getting rid of rangelands and planting crops, or getting rid of all of our row crops and having small diversified fields and rangelands, we need a little bit of everything. So I think that those sort of like sweeping recommendations tend to be a little bit tricky, and then not to mention sort of politically incredibly challenging. But that doesn't mean that there can't be sort of common sense adjustments that have, I think, an argument of fiscal conservatism to them, which is to say that we don't need to be paying out huge outlays for commodity growers, especially when those folks are already incredibly wealthy, or where some of the subsidies tend to go to the largest farms and agribusinesses. Those are probably folks that don't already need the leg up. So there are some sort of common sense cuts, I think, that could be made to commodity programs there. And then similarly, crop insurance is still in theory there because everybody eats. Having a strong domestic production and supply of food and feed and fuel is incredibly important for food and national security. So that safety net is challenging. Agriculture is one of those few businesses where a failure or a massive disruption just means it can mean that there is no crop at all. So I do think that there is a role for the safety net. It's an important piece for producers. But again, we could adjust that in a way that lowers the cost for taxpayers, has them start recognizing that risk-reducing benefit of soil health practices, and supporting producers in, at least in not blocking them in implementing some of these practices. And I would say to maybe go as far as even sort of diversifying what they're growing, which you and I know has sort of overflowing benefits for not just that farmer, but for the community and the state that they live in as well.
Mm. So this work on risk mitigation, it's obviously an important lever when you're talking with policymakers. My understanding is LandCore, you guys have developed a new tool, a risk modeling tool. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in addition to the federal policy work, which we think is really important, but we acknowledge can be sort of a slower mover of change, we have also set out to build and develop our own predictive statistical model of the risk mitigating benefits of soil health practices. This is a project that we have sort of conceptualized and now convened with a wonderful sort of cross-disciplinary team, primarily of academics. We have folks from UC Berkeley and researchers at Rice University in Texas, and Michigan State University and University of Arkansas. So we're kind of working with folks all across the country in different disciplines. And so they are leading quite a robust academic research process. They're looking at remotely sensed data, so the images that we can see from satellites of different practices. They're looking at corn and soybean fields as kind of two dominant crops and frankly, where there's an availability of data. So the study is focused in the Midwest. We have a 9-state study area that across the Midwest Corn Belt that we're looking at. And then they are crunching the data and doing this statistical analysis on whether or not and where and to what extent practices like cover cropping, crop rotations, and reduced tillage have an impact on crop yields. And so in terms of initial findings, we still have lots of research still to do in terms of our desired scope. But even with our preliminary initial findings, we've seen over hundreds of thousands of fields in the state of Illinois alone that indeed, when farmers are increasing the diversity of their crops, if they're adding even a single additional crop into rotation, that in dry conditions, that crop yields not only don't take a major dip, but actually increase a little, which is quite remarkable. The effect is a little more even, quote unquote, even in normal conditions, but during those dry, more stressful events, it's really gratifying to see the research kind of bear out what I think many of us in this space sort of instinctively know and believe to be true, that indeed crop yields are actually sort of increasing a little bit in the stressful conditions. So we're really pleased with that. And then yes, we have the research is being funneled into this online tool that's available online now for folks to go and play with. It's a little wonky and nerdy, but it's a pretty robust tool that folks can work with, and that ultimately we are partnering with different ag lenders and insurers and to some degree policymakers to help them understand and quantify where the risks and benefits might be, and where and how different incentives might be offered. So it's a big, exciting project that we get to work on.
Yeah, I saw you do a demo of it at a conference recently, and it was quite impressive. So I'll just say we'll put the link to that build or the risk modeling tool down below this video in the show notes. So if you want to go check that out, just go into the show notes. We'll also put a link to LandCore's bill tracker, because that is also a really great resource to go in and explore things by bill, or to look at things by legislator to see who has introduced what is the current status of it, what areas does it affect, LandCore's analysis of the bill, and the perceived benefits, and just discussion about it all. It's a wealth of information. um, Going back to the risk modeling tool, as of right now you're just looking at cropland agriculture. Grazing is not included in that as of right now. Is that correct?
That's correct. Our dream would be to expand that to look at the impact of managed grazing as another sort of key soil health principle and practice that I think this community knows better than anyone. There's a little bit of an issue of just availability of data, and maybe even a sort of I think we would need to team up with other organizations to potentially create a remotely sensed data set that looks at the impact um, of rotational grazing, holistically managed grazing. So that's that there's lots of, I think, work and opportunity in the science. I think we know at Michigan State and other places there's incredible research being done on looking more directly at the changes in the soil, and I think also looking at the economic benefits. But being able to do that at a statistically significant level requires that remotely sensed data. So, folks out there listening, we definitely welcome the opportunity to scheme and dream on that one.
Yeah. And is one of the reasons for that being that cropland agriculture is a little more consistent and predictable in terms of being able to look at how does an individual practice change then impact soil health conditions on a fairly homogeneous landscape that is a crop field, versus pasture land and rangeland, which is much more heterogeneous. I mean, you will go walk through someone's pastures, and the slopes on the hillside are very different than the irrigated pastures, and it's very different than down in the riparian area. You've got this large heterogeneity, and I know that when we look at the research, say at soil carbon sequestration in pastures, there is a significant amount of data that needs to be collected to get an accurate analysis of what is actually happening. You can't just go and take a soil core at, one, two, or three locations. You need a significant volume of soil samples to get something that is statistically significant, because of the heterogeneity of that landscape. And therefore, it makes modeling these types of practice changes quite challenging. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah, and on top of that, I think we also just need folks to do the work of sort of training the robots to recognize what the satellites are seeing. We've talked about there. I think there are different ways to potentially look at it. Maybe you might be able to detect forage availability. Maybe you might also look at stocking density. So there would be different sort of indicators that you would have to sort of decide on, and then just do the work of machine learning and training those data sets. We have started to uncover in this risk model research work that sometimes the creation of a particular data set is almost a project in and of itself, even though ultimately it's just an input that we could then use for modeling. And we hope to see, I think, more research and support, or sort of more funding and support, I should say, for research and for data that can be publicly shared and that isn't locked up behind paywalls. There are some incredible companies in the private sector who are really growing leaps and bounds. But if only the largest companies can afford to use that data, then there's sort of like, I think, a limit to the impact that can be had. And we certainly want more nonprofits and more researchers, and then frankly, just more farmers and citizen scientists to be able to see and contribute to and make the data sets and the models better. I mean, that ultimately is our goal, is to have more and more folks look at this, so that the LandCore risk model isn't the one model to rule them all, Lord of the Rings reference, but that USDA, the different private insurance companies, the different lenders might ultimately develop their own. And as I said, that to some degree is dependent on having data that folks can build on.
Mhm. Now, with modeling is predictive. It's trying to say, hey, this is a practice that is changing at the landscape level, and we have reason to believe that this will be the outcome. So that's the purpose of modeling, so that you can have a practice-based approach for the incentives that you're going to be providing to producers.
Yeah.
Are you seeing a shift at all to outcomes-based approaches where it's less reliant on modeling, understanding some of the challenges that exist in modeling, like we were just discussing for grazing lands? Yeah, is there a shift going from practice-based approaches more towards outcomes-based?
Well, it's an interesting question. For those who've been with LandCore for a longer time, I think you might know that we actually sort of started with more of an emphasis on outcomes verification. And then, because of the direction that we took with the risk modeling, because of the availability of the remotely sensed data sets that we did have, and the decision to make a statistical predictive model, and that's different than a process-based model. Some folks know the comment model, and that is actually looking at the changes in the soil. So that there are some different modeling approaches that folks choose to use. I would say that overall, it really is about the context in which that tool is being used, and what sort of either policy or economic incentive it's trying to support. I think that there are a lot of my sense is that some of the federal policies and legislative proposals um, benefit from a practice-based approach, because it's a little bit more consistent with the infrastructure that's already available at USDA. And I'm kind of talking about the recognized NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service within USDA. They have sort of approved conservation practices that have some definition and agreed upon peer-reviewed science. And it's something that legislators and like a county or field level officer at some outposts of USDA would be able to sort of interpret and understand and implement in a just achievable way. But on the other hand, we're starting to see, well, and then I guess like the sustainable aviation fuel with the new guidelines from US Treasury, and a little bit of guidance from USDA as well. That's also looking at individual practices. But then, of course, from the perspective of like the carbon and ecosystem services markets, individual outcomes make a lot more sense for that context or that scheme. So I do think it ultimately is maybe not so much about like which approach is superior, and more just about what context is appropriate. So as always, context is everything.
Absolutely. Yes, we
Yeah.
love to hear that at Savory.
Yes.
Let's dive a little bit into, you mentioned the LandCore's policy priorities. What are the policy priorities at LandCore, and what sorts of pieces of legislation are you following closely right now?
Yes. So this will sound like a little bit of a tie into the previous conversation, but we are championing a piece of legislation that was originally introduced by um, now leader Senate Leader John Thune of South Dakota, as well as the former chairwoman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Senator Stabenow. They had originally introduced a piece of legislation called the Cover Crop Flexibility Act, and that fortunately, we've seen some changes at USDA that address the sort of first part of that bill, which is around making sure that cover crop termination dates on crop lands weren't impeding farmers too heavily. But there was a second half of that piece of legislation that would direct the USDA to do its own research into the risk reducing benefits of soil health practices. And make some sort of recommendation about a discount or incentive for producers who are found to be lower risk. And we noticed that little piece, that second half of the legislation had started to sort of flip behind in the shuffle of everybody's farm bill priorities. And for those who have been following along at home, you might know that the what was supposed to be the 2023 farm bill has been delayed and kind of kicked down the road. So the process for which bills will ultimately be included sort of continues for those of us who are working on this day to day. But we have kind of picked up that piece of legislation and said, oh, this is something that is really kind of common sense and simple. It's a no, or at minimum very low cost proposal that would have the authority in risk assessment and in crop insurance, this risk management agency, do that work of doing its research and recommending discounts for farmers who are found to be adding resilience back into the system and lowering the overall cost for taxpayers. So that's something that I think we can find quite a bit of common ground, I would say, not just on the left and the right, but frankly, as a sort of it's almost like a compromise approach in the Republican Party itself. You have folks, I think, on the sort of hard right who are looking to make major cost to government programs, regardless of how important they are to the sort of farming community. In terms of crop insurance. And then you have other more, I would say, sort of established players who are saying, not only do we not want cuts, this is an extremely important program, but we want to increase the amount of spending on crop insurance for producers. So I think for us, this represents a sort of a nice middle ground and a way forward in an admittedly kind of tricky political environment. So we're optimistic about that, and certainly welcome folks to weigh in, to give comments, to collaborate on that issue. I think there's a lot of potential there.
Mm-hmm. With the farm bill having been delayed so much, I mean, you said it was supposed to pass in 23. We're now in 25. So,
Yeah.
2 years down the road, that obviously, I'm sure, is incredibly frustrating for everyone working on it. But it could potentially open up some areas of opportunity in that there are still things to be discussed and opportunities to really leverage policy change for soil health in this farm bill. So, what do you see as the greatest areas of opportunity in this current debate over the farm bill? Like, what is being discussed? Where is there potential for making change here?
Well, I think at the very highest of levels, just letting Congress know that it is critically important to pass a farm bill, and to not let it get sort of lost in the shuffle of other sort of political and policy changes that are happening in DC. I mean, it is kind of crazy. This is such an important bill to so many people. It truly impacts everybody who eats and all of the folks who grow food. Some folks know it also includes nutrition programs like SNAP. So it is a bill that really touches the lives of a lot of Americans and folks globally as well. So it's just an critically important bill, and especially for farmers who are looking for certainty in their business. Not having that is really starting to cause some harm. So certainly at a minimum, just keeping the noise and the pressure up about the importance of a farm bill is critical. And then I also like to say to folks, whether you're an individual farmer, especially if you have any kind of business or organization, just kind of mapping your influence or your sort of map of where you might have power and the ability to speak to representatives. So that's not just where you live and your personal representative. It might be the location of a ranch or a farm or farmers in your supply chain if you're a business, any sort of like processing plant or equipment, just folks in the larger network. All of those different areas and sort of business locations, et cetera, have representatives who benefit from hearing from folks about how important soil health or regenerative agriculture or holistic management is to you as an individual, to your farm, to your community. So just, I think, really continuing to show up for that issue is so important. I think we sort of tend to forget or minimize the impact that a single letter or phone call can have, but it really does make such a difference. And then I would also, say soil health for us is not just like an issue area; it's a framing, it's a messaging choice as well, and it's a great way to reach a broad range of representatives in this Congress and this administration. But I think around the country and around the globe as well, it is a way to build common ground that is pretty evergreen and can reach a lot of folks. So we certainly recommend kind of trying that framing and that approach on with the people that you're interacting with.
Mhm. You mentioned, just the everyday concerned citizen, reaching out to their representative. Don't
Yeah.
underestimate the power of a phone call or an email. Um, can you give a little bit of color to that? How would someone go about that? What is the proper process to do so? And what should someone say? Do you have any coaching that you can provide someone who is wanting to be a force for good here in terms of the legislative process?
Sure. Well, in this, especially for folks in the US, you can use our federal soil health bill tracker as a starting point. We have a legislators tab, so you can look up either your member or another member that you're interested in and see what bills related to soil health they are already sponsoring. So, one simple kind of email could be, I noticed that you are co-sponsoring this particular bill, and I'm so excited about. Thank you for that. I think those thank you messages keep going. Please keep working on this. Please make sure that this bill is included in the final version of the Farm Bill. Even just something as simple as that, I think, can go a long way. It might also be. So sorry. With the legislators tab, you can not only see what bills individual members are sponsoring, but then you can also click to contact that office. And all offices have both some regional offices in the members' sort of state or district, as well as their offices in DC. So you can email, you can call, and whether it's about a specific bill or just to say, hey, I'd like to let the Congress man or Congresswoman know that soil health and regenerative agriculture is extremely important to me for these reasons. And please make sure that there is broad support for soil health and conservation programs in the upcoming Farm Bill. Even just that at a high level is something concrete and constructive and positive that folks can reach out about anytime. And of course, sometimes there will be sort of more timely campaigns from different organizations that you follow to say, "Hey, everyone, come on and support this particular piece of legislation," or block some other problematic piece of legislation from passing. But truly, any time of day, folks can reach out, and members really do take stock of that. And it's, I think, especially for those of us who care about this issue, it's important to reach out because even though we know that it's connected to our food, our resilience, our communities, our local businesses, our farmers, it frankly is an issue that's kind of lower down on the polls in terms of where voters put the most pressure on their representatives. So I think for those reasons, if we want to elevate food and ag in the minds of policymakers to the level of importance that we know that it has, then we have to speak up. So that's an ongoing area of work.
Do you think that the bipartisan nature of regenerative agriculture, or I don't know if it's correct to say bipartisan or nonpartisan, but however you frame it, is that an important piece of that to legislators?
I think so. I think you can sort of come right out and say it. I mean, certainly, as I was sort of suggesting, using the framing like soil health might be have some sort of broader appeal. But I think you can also say, like, I work with, or I am a farmer in this area, and how I vote and how my neighbor votes are different, but we both really believe um, in what happens when you start focusing on the soil. And that those of us who are lucky enough to work in this space, and we get to interact with all sorts of folks that vote also all sorts of ways, and there's just so much. There really is a genuine shared common ground and sort of I think, a love of the land and excitement about what happens when you start bringing back the soil. So I think
Mhm.
in a lot of ways, we're just so lucky to have this as our issue and invite more folks to kind of come in and see what you can accomplish by having that focus on soil health.
Yeah. Now, okay, so the Farm Bill, obviously, it's the big major area of opportunity. It's the big piece of legislation that's top of mind, front and center for all that we're talking about with regenerative ag and soil health. Are there any other bills or legislation or discussions that are happening that are flying under the radar where there might be significant area of opportunity, things that would be helpful for folks to pay attention to and maybe make a little bit of noise about?
Yes. Now, of course, I think for folks who are tuned into the context of U.S. and political news, there is, of course, just a lot of news happening at the moment. That's always true in a new administration, but it's especially true at the moment. So, I think, especially not knowing exactly when this podcast will come out, we'll keep this like relatively sort of evergreen. But there will no doubt be changes and adjustments that folks can be paying attention to and responding to as they see fit. In terms of sort of legislative vehicles that kind of fly under the radar, in addition to the big every 5-year farm bill process, there's also the annual appropriations bill, the spending bill that determines the amount of money that goes towards certain programs that impact, in our case, agriculture and food. So following whether it's LandCore or another organization that's focused on policy and helping them to amplify the requests for spending in the annual appropriations process. That's something that doesn't get as much sort of news or attention, but just is definitely impacts all of us. That could be true, for example, if you're interested in agricultural research, say, then showing up for the appropriations process is really important in making sure that we sort of at least maintain, if not increase, spending for ag research. That's a great place to start. There are some conservation programs also that are. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but that instead of having mandatory spending, have discretionary funds that need to be issued each year through that appropriations process. So that's a wonky one, but definitely a moment of opportunity. There are also these big budget reconciliation bills that pass, and there are very often spending changes, and those can be a little bit complicated to follow, but certainly for organizations that are already have their feet wet, making sure that you're keeping up with um, either sort of cuts or additions to food and ag programs. That's another important area of opportunity. And then I will just say, too, of course, that within any federal government and state governments, you have your most folks have some sort of Department of Agriculture, and so just getting to know what the programs are in your state or federally, I think are a huge area of opportunity. There are very often sort of organizations dedicated to conservation, like a resource conservation district or conservation service. There's just all sorts of different ways to advance soil health at the state level and with some of those sort of regional offices. So just getting to know the infrastructure that's in your community is an area where folks can have, I think, a disproportionate amount of influence and voice.
Mhm. Outside of the USDA, are there other agencies where there are opportunities for leverage for soil health and regenerative ag?
Yeah, we've started to look at, I think, especially through this lens of risk mitigation, to broach conversations with agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, which is sort of natural engineering, thinking about the soil as a sponge. And then that's also true, I think, at FEMA, which oversees emergency management, well, preparedness as well as disaster response. And again, I think just helping more folks to think about soil and soil health as a part of their toolkit for making communities more resilient is something that I think is excited and under leveraged. And I think if folks are looking to get more involved into this space and haven't found their lane yet, I would really encourage people to look at the opportunities around that. There's just so much incredible work that could be done with some a dedicated push.
What about
Yeah.
BLM? There's obviously a lot of grazing that happens on BLM land. Do you see any movement happening there? Any discussions happening?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. I think that that's such an amazing area of opportunity. BLM and the Bureau of Land Management has this, I think, historically a kind of framing of different land uses, and you can use public lands for energy production, you can use public lands for grazing, you can use public lands for conservation, and I think, frankly, particularly with conservation and grazing, it's there is often this sort of entrenched argument or idea that they're in opposition to one another. And I think this community knows better than anybody that um, grazing, when done in a sort of holistic way, when context is taken into account, that those two things can be absolutely copacetic and really mutually beneficial for profit, for business, to the advantage of the ranchers and graziers that are managing that land, but also very much to improve and hit conservation goals. So we had the opportunity to submit some comments to BLM in response to a proposed rule that they had put out about conservation and landscape health, and we were really proud of the work that we put together there. That I think makes a pretty strong argument again that these two uses are absolutely can be in harmony, and that little adjustments like land leases that require some sort of regenerative management, and I think also potentially that could be an area where an outcomes based approach is helpful. But certainly, even just having a holistic management plan in place as part of those public leases for grazing could be an incredible opportunity. So I think it's the beginning of that conversation, but definitely an area of work and interest for folks. And happy to talk and collaborate with anyone who's interested in doing more in that space.
Yeah, it's an interesting mental exercise to try to think of soil health not just through the typical lens of production agriculture, and try to see it
It's,
through the lens of everything else that touches agriculture. Which those of us in this space really appreciate the interconnectedness of land, animals,
yeah,
plants, people, and just how all of that works together and influences every aspect of our lives.
yeah,
Going to FEMA, BLM, USDA,
yeah.
HHS. It seems like a case could be made in pretty much any agency. I'm sure you could get into DOD or CIA
Yeah.
somehow. I'm sure there's
Oh,
something that you could do if you tried hard enough to find a soil health angle.
yeah, absolutely. And I don't even think it's a stretch. There really are all of those connections to human health, to food and national security. Looking at the whole amazing world of the microbiome and the soil microbiome. There's just so much there. So I do think that we're on the cusp of a pretty exciting time in terms of new research and new connections, kind of validating what those of us have suspected for a little while to be increasingly true, and understanding how those connections are made. So it's a wonderful time, I think, to jump into the space or to deepen that work and to think about opportunities outside of agriculture to support our food and farming systems and our own health and resilience.
Now, I want to be conscious of the fact that we have listeners that are listening from outside of the US. And so, we've been talking a lot about American politics, and that seems to happen a lot in the regenerative ag space. Is a lot of conversations seem to be largely US and or North American focused. What can you say for those that are listening from outside of the US in terms of either resources for organizations that perhaps they should be following along? For example, I know that a bunch of folks in the Savory network are part of a new organization called the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture. ERA, I
Mm.
think is the acronym, how that's pronounced. But are there other organizations that are similar to LandCore, but perhaps um, focusing on healthy soils in other countries, or other resources, or lessons learned, even that folks outside of the U.S. can take from everything that you're doing?
Yeah, I think unfortunately so much of our focus is really on the US. But I will say that I do think that the some of the needs and opportunities strike me as being remarkably similar. I think some of the issues that Australia or Canada or Europe, and I imagine to some degree in other developed nations is just strikingly true. There are issues with the cost of land in terms of young and beginning farmers getting into the business. There are issues with and opportunities in terms of codifying the approach to measuring and monitoring and reporting on soil health, and then having, as we kind of touched on, get that applied to whether it's a new scheme or an incentive with a national bank like National Australia Bank. I know is looking at this in Australia, which is exciting, but there's always just sort of more work to do there with measurement and monitoring and reporting. Um, just kind of on and on. I mean, I think that that's part of what is validating and exciting about this space is that the principles of soil health do bear out to be true across different countries and contexts. And that similar sort of lessons learned, I think, in terms of, I would certainly advise a focus, wherever possible, on the economic benefits of soil health practices. I'd advise a focus on policies and programs that are incentive based and voluntary, because I think while you might make some grounds in a more, sort of quote unquote progressive area or progressive legislature, that doesn't mean that it isn't also susceptible to backlash, which can, inadvertently set us back. And it's hard to see how that plays out except in hindsight. So just being, I think, keeping a mind to campaigns and legislation and programs that are evergreen in their feel, and that are so kind of slow and steady in their build, I think ultimately might have more sort of durability, as well as sort of upfront viability in terms of getting things passed. And just dealing with politics, I think that the political trends are like weirdly similar in a lot of these different countries. So um, that's a general note, but I think one that's worth heeding.
hmm I can't help but notice we keep coming back to making the economic case for soil
Yeah.
health. It seems to be that is probably the greatest acupuncture point for these discussions. And so, um, I'm kind of curious, when you engage with a lawmaker, or some sort of gatekeeper who has influence, like, how does that conversation go around the economic case? Like, pretend I'm a lawmaker and you're making the economic case for soil health. How would you state your case?
Well, I'm not so good at the role playing, but
We don't have to role
I
play, or you can just talk through it.
no, no. Well, I think that where folks have that natural skepticism, I think we tend to come in and say like, oh, these incredible soil health practices are going to do so much on a farmer's operation, and folks will be like, well, those risky, unproven, innovative, weird, wild, new soil health practices. we need to go carefully and we need to support farmers in taking those risks. So I think where you have that sort of inherent, like either like that's not going to work for us, that might work for those people over there, but that's not going to work in our backyard, or just the perception of innovation and risk that is, just sort of beyond what's known or what's already adopted in a member's district or on a farmer's farm. To talk about the cost savings that can be gained from by building soil health, being able to either do sort of less passes with a tractor, or maybe purchasing a little bit less synthetic nitrogen fertilizer because you're building the fertility through plants and through the health of the soil. Being able to do a soil health test and show, well, actually, like there's plenty of nitrogen here. You might be able to reduce your inputs by 30%. Let's talk about the profitability of that. Crunching those numbers. If you're a farmer or rancher yourself and you can share that story with an office, that's as good as it gets. And then we try to sort of echo and amplify those stories with those members to show, well, actually, even though it might seem a little crazy and a little bit different than what we've been doing, in fact, there are these benefits.
Mm. Are there any
Yeah.
specific data points that you find yourself going back to that are particularly effective? And I guess that could be data points or reports or even anecdotal stories from folks that you've engaged with. Like what causes people to perk up and lean in when you talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I think that the findings from our risk model research to say that, well, in fact, crop rotations and dry weather are increasing yields a little bit. I think that gets folks to sit up a little bit, because sometimes there's the assumption that maybe these practices will have some benefits over the long term, but there's going to be an initial yield dip for the first 3 to 5 years. So I think just even showing that, in fact, there can be some upfront gains gets folks' attention. I think the amount of, the 1% increase in soil organic matter leading to sort of, what is it, an additional 26 thousand gallons sort of per acre of water available on the field, talking about being able to reduce the cost of irrigation or the amount of irrigation. Is pretty darn compelling. And then, there are also folks, I think, sort of maybe on the more pointy end of the spear, but folks who feel like they don't even need to pay for the cost of a crop insurance policy because they're so confident in the resilience of their operation. They feel that they've built up their soil health so much that sort of line item on their budget just isn't necessary anymore. I think that can be pretty interesting for folks to hear as well.
Mhm. What about the climate implications? Is that a driver of conversation? I've noticed that it hasn't really come up much in this conversation, despite it being fairly prominent in the broader regenerative agriculture space. Is that something that is perhaps of lesser concern for policymakers?
Our sense is that it is not the overarching sort of driver of new policies in agriculture for the majority of members. I think that there are some Democrats who have kind of made that a flagship sort of part of the issue, that in order to address climate, we want to build up our soil health and resilience. Again, I think I have some concerns with the durability of those policies and proposals. Um, Also, I think that there are, in terms of the farmers and ranchers that these policies are designed to serve, certainly there are some folks that's why they get out of bed in the morning, that they're there for that reason. But I think in terms of reaching a broader swath of farmers, especially folks who might already be farming in a more conventional way, to get support those folks and even kind of considering transitioning, our sense is that climate is not necessarily the sort of starting sort of motivator, or the way that you would open that conversation. Although, of course, any producer is going to be able to tell you when the weather is wacky or has been a tough year, and we're seeing plenty of that. And I think in places where there have been, some of the hurricanes in the South, for example, seeing Paul Grieve from Pasture Bird talking about how well he was able to hold up in those really significant rainstorms and flooding and everything, and to see that those pastures were draining well. I think that those anecdotal, like, we got hit and we came out not too bad, and our neighbors unfortunately didn't fare as well. That's to me, that's pretty significant. But I do think it really it's about knowing your audience and starting with the whatever rationale is going to appeal to them first and foremost. There's a marketing communications approach to it.
Yeah, it seems like the climate discussion is one that is perhaps not leading, but it's the pieces where climate affects things in terms of risk mitigation for,
Yeah,
wildfire, drought, flooding, some of these
yeah.
areas that you've mentioned. So it's not a discussion of what is the parts per million of atmospheric CO2 and what is the potential for healthy soils to reduce that number in terms of decarbonizing the atmosphere. But it's more a discussion of how can we build resilience into our landscapes and what does that mean for our agricultural producers and the communities that they serve. Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's I would say that that's a stronger way in, and just again something that is probably more relevant and tangible and meaningful, both to a farmer rancher and potentially to, I think for sure, for policymakers as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, well said.
What What are your thoughts around what is your theory of change, I guess, is what I want to ask. And what I mean by that is you hear from a lot of people that change starts at the grassroots level and builds through public sentiment. And as that gains critical mass and enough momentum, eventually the powers that be, the government forces and politics will eventually follow, but they'll follow with massive force. And so that seems to be a theory of change that many folks have, that if you're going to try to enact change, you need to start at the grassroots level and build coalitions and build momentum from there. And don't expect government to change things for you. You work directly at the top down approach, trying to influence change with those policymakers. And so is your theory of change different from those that say it starts at the grassroots level and that government eventually follows? Where do you sit with that?
I My approach to theory of change is that multiple theories of change can and should be sort of complementary. Excuse me. So maybe I think absolutely, that grassroots approach is needed. I think that not underestimating or not giving away your power as an individual is extremely important. It's extremely empowering to take stock of all of the ways in which you do have voice, and the ways in which I can speak even for myself. I think we under leverage those opportunities to have a voice all the time. It's why sort of like community city council meetings just kind of fly by under the radar because we're just doing whatever else that we're doing with our Tuesday night and not showing up. So there are all sorts of opportunities for folks at the individual level. I think particularly in the instance of agriculture, in which we do have some pretty entrenched major systems. We haven't just sort of consolidated what we grow in this country. We've also consolidated a lot of the infrastructure that gets that product to market. So there are some like major pieces of infrastructure that do need some policy changes, or policy changes that support shifts in what we invest and where, that I think are just not impossible, but can be changed at a larger level. Like you can fundraise as an individual community member to get a new seed cleaning piece of infrastructure or a new mill in your community or in your local food and watershed, and individually build up that infrastructure. And there are wonderful examples of that happening all over the country. But I do think that our sense is that the extent to which that needs to happen individually versus being able to make some of those sort of more system level changes, as we've said, does sort of come from that federal or policy approach. And then that's true because we're also looking at the flows of money. We've had this wonderful sort of shift in this movement from, okay, great, got it, soil health, the regenerative agriculture. Those are terms that are now on so many more folks' lips, and there is that sort of base level of awareness. But we are, I think, as an industry and as a movement, focusing on the how now, and that is policy, that is finance, that is crop insurance. It's some of these sort of systemic changes, and again, policy just is one of the ways that gets impacted, but
Mhm.
not in
Now, what about
opposition to other theories of change.
coming from a slightly different angle, looking not at the federal level, but looking at change happening more at the state and local level? How does state and local affect federal policy, if at all? Or do you find any correlation between what's happening at the state and local level and federal level?
Yeah, I mean, there are great state level programs, like the Illinois cover crop program that was paying farmers $5 an acre to implement cover crops. The fact that sort of bipartisan programs with farmer participation and sort of feedback and evidence on how they worked and where they can be improved, that's very sort of solid grounds with which to approach federal policy. So those examples, might be a little bit easier to get started or to get off the ground, and then they absolutely can inform and support and encourage the federal process. So that's one piece. Of course, state and local are the sort of playing fields in which federal policies are enacted. So it also goes in the other direction as well. But yeah, I think that there are both sort of opportunities and moments of connection at all sort of three scales there.
We're probably going to start wrapping up here. I've gone through, I'm amazed. I had so many questions and I've actually been able to ask a lot of them. So, we've been going at a pretty steady clip, which I
Yeah.
appreciate. Uh, Efficiency in interviewing. But I'm just kind of curious where you see soil health policy going, let's say, over the next 5 to 10 years. Realistically, where do you think things are headed?
It's a good question. I do think that overall the genie is out of the bottle, and that more and more players are going to continue to show up for agriculture, for regenerative agriculture, for soil health in a way that just continues to expand all of our collective work. I do think, of course, in the U.S. there are going to be some, I think, some pretty significant changes one way or the other that might maybe sort of temporarily impact how people participate or shift and change. But overall, I do think that the momentum is going to continue to grow the education and the understanding. We have this incredible, I think for some folks, unexpected moment where the connection between soil health and human health is really sort of on the political stage. And, you have conservatives talking about the ills of ultra processed foods, and Democrats taking sort of different approaches altogether. So it is kind of like a mixed up topsy turvy time in which sort of traditional political lines aren't necessarily holding, and I guess maybe said sort of more clearly and positively, there's just interest really across the board in making some of these adjustments and centering soil health, whether that's in the dietary guidelines or in procurement for school lunches and at universities and hospitals. All of these interesting opportunities where supporting farmers in producing crops domestically and abroad, and creating real markets and opportunities to expand that work. There just is a lot of interest and opportunity there. So um, I think probably while there will be a little bit of skittishness at the in terms of involvement in federal policy, or just I guess I would frame it as uncertainty, because we are expecting some changes. That overall won't stop the momentum and involvement in soil health policy.
Yeah, one would hope. You did mention just now the USDA dietary guidelines, and so I'm
Yes.
curious: is there anything in the works for soil health and/or regenerative agriculture as it relates to USDA dietary guidelines?
I think that's actually overseen by the Health and Human Services Department. But of course, how that plays out in terms of agriculture, it certainly has sort of immediate knock-on effects there. But yes, there were recently some sort of public comment opportunities to talk about shaping the next round of the dietary guidelines for 2030, looking quite far ahead. And LandCore submitted some very high level comments talking about the opportunity of including soil health. This is not a typical area of focus for us, but um, where we see an opportunity to advance soil health, and we think that we can put together something that has some merit and grounds, and I think that is kind of a fair game. And yeah, I do think it would be pretty interesting and exciting to see, not just sort of like what kind of food, but helping more Americans and more individuals, think about how that food is grown as the center of health. That's quite a wonderful and practical manifestation of all of that.
Yeah. Could you provide some of the specifics of some of the comments that LandCorp provided on the dietary guidelines, just to get into the weeds a little bit of what might a uh, a consideration for soil health look like in the dietary guidelines, like specifically?
I mean, more broadly, we've kind of talked about just simply promoting soil health and agriculture and encouraging dietary choices and food systems that support soil health, including food grown from farms or ranches that implement soil health management practices. Um, that can also be expressed in terms of increasing the diversity of foods, both grown and consumed. I think we talk about having variety in our diets, but then thinking about how that connects back to the farm, and all of us thinking about ways that we can support farmers in growing a broader diversity of crops and livestock is that is how we improve soil health. Um, Dietary guidelines can also do things like supporting local and seasonal eating, and it could also do things like encouraging education on the sort of soil food nutrition link. So there's a range of sort of simple principles that we've included, including encouraging perennial crops is another one. Your fruit and nut and tree crops are wonderful for the soil and for more resilient systems, and are very often correlated with some of those healthier diets as well. So there's lots of different ways that can take shape, and I imagine we can probably share the link to those comments as well, so folks can get an idea.
Wonderful. We will put them in the show notes. Um, so I guess just to start to wrap things up, or maybe to wrap things up here, what's the future look like for you and LandCore? What sorts of things do you have on the horizon? What do you want to let folks know about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say that we are continuing to expand our risk modeling research, and we're looking forward to publishing additional results, both in academic papers, but also in the tool itself. And then I would say that we are cooking up additional partnerships with ag lenders and insurers that can sort of start to um, take into consideration and maybe even offer new incentives, or say a new crop insurance policy that recognizes the risk reducing benefits of these practices. So that area of work is something that we're really excited about and welcome sort of input and collaboration on. There are sort of endless opportunities in the federal policy space, and I would say policy space more broadly. So we will be kind of continuing to be a really consistent, steady voice for soil health and in all of the arenas that we can be, and encourage folks and others to do the same. I think the value of consistency, the value of showing up is, sort of a little bit of a theme for this conversation. So we will be doing that and encourage other folks to do the same as well. We have a monthly newsletter that folks can sign up. It's a little text heavy, but folks do read it, which we appreciate. I love all of the people who write to us and let us know that they read our long, wonky stuff. But no, we try to make it as engaging and accessible as possible. It's definitely, as we've sort of talked about, we are pretty committed to offering educational resources and nonpartisan resources. So of course, we have a perspective about soil health, but this is a big tent, and building coalition with a broad range of folks and welcoming in people at any stage of the journey is definitely part of where we're at. So yeah, this is all ongoing work to continue.
Well, it's ongoing work, but it is meaningful work, and we need it. And I am glad to have a policy wonk in this space that I can refer folks to. So please keep it up so that I don't have to get into the weeds on all of this legislation, because otherwise my head would explode. So thank you, Aria, and the rest of the LandCore team for all you do. For all of our listeners, again, LandCore is the organization, and we'll have links to everything discussed in the show notes. And Aria, just want to thank you again for coming on and talking about how the sausage is made with us. Greatly appreciate it.
Anytime. And yeah, thank you so much for all the good work that you're doing. It's great to have this chat. Come on in. The water is nice. Folks will enjoy it.
Great. All right. Thanks, Aria. Yeah. Take care.
Thanks, Avi. Bye.
This episode was edited by Claire Everson, and her theme music was composed and performed by Travis McNamara. Ruminations is a production of the Savory Institute, the Savory Foundation, and Land to Market. If you like this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast and subscribing to our YouTube channel, where you can find video versions of all episodes, plus other content. If you're looking for show notes, links to things mentioned in the episode, transcripts, sponsorship info, or if you'd like to even suggest a guest to come on the show, all of that can be found on our website at savory.global/podcast. And last but certainly not least, thank you to our committed and growing community of regenerating members whose monthly support allows Savory to produce this podcast and continue advancing holistic management all across the globe. If you're not yet a member, we welcome you to join us with open arms, and we would love to have you as part of our community. Just sign up at savory.global/member. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.